I never really liked the San Francisco 49ers. I hate to admit this, but, I was a Kansas City Chiefs fan, so I never really liked Joe Montana until he came to Kansas City and did great things at Kansas City. What would be the, top one or two leadership lessons you picked up just watching him in action?
I think the guy was amazing. One of the leadership actions that he always had, he was a big superstar before I got there. I got there in 1987. He had won a couple of Super Bowls before that, in 81 and 84 with the 49ers. And he was a legend, in the sporting world. But you know what? You come in and you go with Joe, and you know what? He was always the first one at the facility. Always. Okay. Watching film. He'd have the game plan Xerox home to him, or fax home to him when they had fax machines back in the day. He'd study that game plan. He'd show up early on Monday morning, getting ready for the next game. And the thing I also think about Joe was always the guy that, if they were serving a buffet line for lunch or a buffet line for dinner, Joe was always the last guy in line. He wasn't the first guy in line. He was always the last guy. He never, he was always, took the worst seat on the bus, always made sure that everybody else was taken care of. He had dinners for teammates. He led like that. He was a humble type of leader. He led from behind, which was the thing that I learned from Joe, is that, hey, your actions speak louder than your words do, and his actions were certainly leadership actions.
And you also played alongside Jerry Rice, arguably the best receiver of all time. What did you pick up watching him in action?
Well, Jerry Rice was a guy that he played with a big chip on his shoulder. Jerry, he came from a small school in Mississippi. He really was never given anything his whole life, and he came in and he was determined to be the best. And Jerry, again, was nonstop in catching footballs. I mean, he was an amazing work addict. I mean, he'd sprint in the off seasons. He'd catch balls in the off season. When Steve Young became the quarterback of the 49ers, Steve Young got so tired of throwing left-handed at Jerry that they recruited a guy by the name of Ted Walsh, who was our left-handed equipment manager. And Ted would stay out there for hours and hours throwing balls at Jerry Rice left-handed, just so Jerry could adjust to see how the spin was coming off of a left-hander versus a right-hander who had been with Joe Montana for so long. So Jerry was just a work addict, and you know what? He was quiet in the huddle. He was a hard worker. I mean, he was an unbelievable blocker downfield. He was so unselfish. I mean, he was a pleasure to work with for all those years.
So it's pretty clear that the best players, they really set the tone in terms of their overall work ethic, right? And that had to be something was huge. But they also seem to play with great character. Talk about the character part of what makes up the great leader.
Well, again, going back to Montana, right? So I played a little bit of center in college. I played a little bit of center in the pros. And typically you see, a young center comes out there and a bad snap would happen in a game. And always Joe would come to the sideline after a bad snap and he'd go, "That was my fault. I take ownership of that. It wasn't Harris's fault. It was my fault. Or it wasn't Randy Cross's fault, who was the center. It was my fault." And so anytime he threw an interception, it was his fault. He saw the safety doing the wrong thing. He never, ever, got in somebody's face and said, "Hey, you know what? That's your fault. You should take the blame for that." So that's the type of leadership that teams need to be successful. And a guy like Mahomes shows that, right? And a guy like Tom Brady shows that. They're out working everybody, they're out hustling everybody, but they're also being humble, and they're being they're taking the blame when things go wrong.